Good evening and welcome to AZ Illustrated Politics. I'm Sarah Garrecht Gassen, subbing for Jim Ninsel. Tonight we'll take a look at Governor Jan Brewer's decision not to seek another term and at the legacy she will leave behind. What happened or what didn't happen at the state legislature this week as the session wears on without much talk of a budget. And water issues in the Santa Cruz Valley with a proposal for allocation of Tucson's share of Central Arizona project water. All of that and more. But first, a look at tonight's headlines from state and local news.
The cost of a college education will rise in Arizona this fall. That's if the Board of Regents approves increases proposed by the state's 3 public universities. At the University of Arizona, current students who are state residents will pay about $10,600 a year, up $200. For incoming freshmen who are state residents, tuition would be $11,000. For those freshmen, tuition would not change for 4 years, in keeping with Governor Jan Brewer's call for stability for families paying for higher education. The federal government's monthly assessment of snowpack in the West says Arizona continues well below normal levels. The report is the latest confirmation of ongoing drought in the state. A bright spot in the report is that Lake Powell on the Colorado River will experience above normal stream flow because of higher snowpack levels upstream. Employment levels among teenagers in Pima County fell significantly during the last decade. That's according to a report from the Brookings Institution. It says about 26% of teens, those ages 16 to 19, had jobs in 2012, 17 percentage points lower than the number in the year 2000. The report says of special significance is that many of those unemployed are also not enrolled in school, putting them at risk for falling into poverty. And that's a look at tonight's headlines.
The search for that missing Malaysian airliner took another twist today. After a week of few clues and no answers, new evidence suggests it flew for hours after vanishing from radar. And it's Friday. Mark Shields and David Brooks are here to analyze the week's news. Those are just some of the stories we're covering on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Tonight, Arizona Week goes inside a Tucson school and a community health clinic to see how they're impacted by budget decisions made at the state capitol. That's tonight at 8:30 on PBS 6.
The state constitution says a governor can serve no more than 2 consecutive terms. Yet Jan Brewer has openly discussed the idea of seeking what most say would be a 3rd term. This week, though, Brewer announced she won't run again and instead will, as she put it, pass the torch. Joining me to discuss that and more of the week's political news are Tucson Weekly writer Mari Herreras, Green Valley News editor Dan Shearer, and TucsonSentinel.com editor Dylan Smith. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to start off talking about Governor Brewer's announcement. Not entirely a surprise to people who've been paying attention that she wasn't going to run for a 3rd term. Dan, could you kind of update us on what the background is? How could you even think that she could run for what most people would consider a 3rd term?
Well, that's a good question, too, because as you said, it was not a surprise to any of us. It seemed to be a surprise a little bit to the national media, and I know even the New York Times jumped on it. But this wasn't a surprise to us, and it certainly wasn't a surprise to at least 8 GOP candidates who must have anticipated that she did not want to go through a lengthy court battle, and I think she knows that that's what would have happened. But we also know that she's really not out of it because her influence is going to last for years.
And Dylan, could you talk about what that influence, what the root of that is? Is it just her political savvy? Is it money? Where does that come from?
She's got money. She's got $1 million in the bank, and that's even with all the money that might pour into Arizona in this election year certainly counts for something. And really, I think her waiting to make this announcement was to sort of be able to capitalize on that fact and make a little bit of a splash in the media, and us sort of chasing what really isn't news. It's kind of, pigs still can't fly. We all knew that was going to be the result, but nonetheless, everybody did the story.
So her $1 million is in her PAC, her political action committee that she's been fundraising, and she'll be able to dole out national candidates. But she's also talked about wanting to make an impact with state legislators. She's made a statement to Capitol Media Services talking about how the Republican leadership, as it is now, if you're not an ideologue, then you're kind of out of the tent. Mari, could you explain that a little bit, what her thinking is, and do you think she's going to be successful in that?
I guess I hope so. If her thinking is what I'd hoped when I heard her say that, is that perhaps to funnel that money towards state candidates that aren't ideologues, that aren't part of the problem that we've been experiencing. Maybe her own experience now with Kathy Herreras and that group of the Arizona Center for Policy. And I think that maybe that offers some hope, I suppose, of where those millions will go.
And Dylan, do you think, I mean, Jan Brewer's reputation isn't exactly one of being middle of the road as far as Republicans go. What do you think she will consider middle of the road, or she didn't say middle of the road, but the non-ideologue, the more practical Republicans? What do you think she's looking for?
Jan Brewer is kind of an interesting case in that respect, that she has this reputation of being so very conservative, and yet some of the things that she's really spent some of her own political capital on have been decisions that many in the Republican Party didn't agree with, you know, expanding Medicare and the education tax a few years ago. So one of the most interesting things for me...
I should just say she expanded Medicaid.
Medicaid,
yeah.
Yes.
Easy to
Access.
confuse those two, yes.
It's going to be interesting to see who she endorses in the governor's race. You know, I don't think it will be Doug Ducey, the state treasurer, who is gathering a lot of Tea Party support and is going to try and have to somehow run against a little bit what he's been doing as state treasurer if he wants to run against Jan Brewer in her legacy.
So Dan, looking forward to the Republican field, because the Democrats have Fred Duvall. He's their guy. He's their candidate who's going to stand against whoever the Republicans come up with in the general election. We have Ken Bennett, Secretary of State. We have Doug Ducey, as you mentioned. We have some other notables here in Southern Arizona, like State Senator Al Melvin. What does the field look like? You
know, I think the one that you didn't mention and should not be overlooked is Scott Smith, who's the mayor of Mesa. And he has already, in 5 years in office, done some terrific things. He has a great track record. He has a good following. He is a consensus builder. He is doing well in the polls, not as well as I think Christine Jones and Ken Bennett, but he's doing well. He is definitely, to me, the one to watch here. And so you're right, Fred Duvall is very formidable. It's going to be a very interesting race. We haven't had it wide open like this in quite a while. And so there are a lot to watch. It's interesting for us down in Green Valley because they all sweep through there. We have a forum coming up on March 22nd. Half of them have committed, five of them have committed to come there. So it's going to be a very interesting political year if that's your thing.
So, Mari, I wanted to touch on SB 1070, the immigration law that Arizona became so famous for. And Jan Brewer has really kind of made her national name signing that. What do you see going forward in terms of her using that legacy to shape national policy, if that's even an option?
I guess she could, continue the finger pointing toward the federal feds, right? That would be the one anticipation. However, I'd hate for her to use that in any way as part of her showing her legacy of being someone who's helped the Arizona economy when, the signing of SB 1070 right at the top of the recession, our tourism lost more than $14 million or more. We still, that's a debatable figure there. Not the best time to lose those funds. And that was just those were just tourism dollars. People were leaving and the rental market was in shambles. So I hope I would hope that she wouldn't use it as part of a legacy to show what a great job she did in terms of helping the Arizona economy.
And you know, I have to disagree if I could, because SB 1070, take it for what it was. It wasn't perfect, but what was it? It was a cry of frustration. And we had Janet Napolitano, who was before her, who said that she was going to deal with immigration. We had Jan Brewer, who was looking to Congress to do something on it, and they never did anything that was really worthwhile. And so to me, SB 1070, despite its imperfections, was a cry of frustration that did get people back focused on the issue. And I agree, it did hurt Arizona a little bit, but as far as her legacy, I don't necessarily look at it as a negative.
Well, I think you might be, I mean, I know many people in the state would agree with you, but others, particularly in southern Arizona, I think would have a different opinion. Southern Arizona, some of the lawmakers, saluted her for her push through getting Medicaid expansion through, which to some of the conservatives, the hardcore conservatives, just made her persona non grata. What do you think, Dylan, that on balance, how she's going to be viewed? Is she going to be viewed as a true conservative, or will that kind of something that Democrats and maybe moderates thought were more admirable traits or actions?
There's a big gulf between a traditional Republican conservative and a Tea Party Republican. And I don't think that, despite a lot of the fundraising campaigns from the Democrats, I don't think you can really call Jan Brewer a Tea Partier. No. She does not fit into that mold at all. She is a fairly conservative Republican, though. You certainly, despite her agreeing with the Democrats on some of those issues, those were issues that the business camp in Arizona really supported, and she was pretty much in line with that.
Do you think that the conservatives in the remaining Republican contenders are going to have to try to outdo each other? What do we have to look forward to in the next several months over the summer as everyone in that big group of candidates tries to vie for any shred of attention? What do you think, Mari?
I think Doug Ducey will be one that, we've talked about him in terms of being a teabagger that may not have the support, but actually he does, and he's been raising money fairly well. Once we start the process of getting into election mode of spending that money, I think we'll see Ducey come up a little bit more to the top. Then, I think with the Democrats, and this is really, it's going to be the Republican race. With the Democrats, I think it's going to, Fred Duvall, I think, just to quote my mom in her recent call that she got from the local Democratic Party, I don't know this man, and I think that's going to be, name recognition is going to be an issue. Yes, he was Arizona board chair, co-chair of the Arizona Board of Regents, but you're still going to have people like my mom, who are voters, steadfast voters who don't know who Fred Duvall is.
Dan, you brought up Janet Napolitano, former governor who went on to Homeland Security chief and now runs the California university system. A lot of Democrats are really angry at her, and I've been hearing that surfacing again. I think just, with the word of the transition, that she sort of abandoned Arizona to a group led by Jan Brewer that some didn't think was a good choice. Do you get any sense about that?
I think that really came up 5 years ago, and it was, but when the president calls, you go. And I can't blame her for leaving Arizona, but it was at a very key time. We were just heading down, could have used that leadership, but let's, as we talk about Jan Brewer's legacy, let me quote from the New York Times. It said, "Brewer ruled during what it calls one of the most tumultuous legislative periods in the state's history." But we have to remember that she was also in office during the toughest economic period probably in the last 40 years. So has she brought us out of it? No, but it's going to be a slow climb out for Arizona, slower than most other states. But remember this, that for the past 5 years, this has been a very, very difficult time. So part of her legacy is that she ruled during this rough time, and Janet Napolitano did bump out during that. But you can't blame Napolitano. Good heavens, I mean, she was given this wonderful opportunity, and even going to California, again, a great opportunity. So I don't hear that buzz very much, but I do understand it.
Shifting a bit from the governor's office to the House and the Senate, up in the state legislature, Common Core has been kind of in the headlines again. Mari, could you tell us briefly what is it? I mean, we hear a lot about it. What's the shorthand version, and then what is the latest with where we are?
Well, it brings for lack of a better word, a common curriculum that or standard that the districts would be expected to follow. So starting from federal to state, and then the school districts would then turn around and make sure that our curriculums are matching that. And the question is, assessing that, and then if the school districts have enough funds to really implement this, which is debatable at this point. But the other issue is, in terms of our state Republicans, is it comes from the feds, and so therefore it's untouchable. It's not something they really want to put anything behind, even though we have a strong business community who really was hoping that they were going to support it in the end.
And the Republicans in the legislature are criticizing it now, but they approved it several years ago. So, Dylan, can you talk about that? What's this reversal about?
It's a good way to grab headlines. It's a good way to wag the finger in the face of the federal government. Again, that looks good. I don't know how much that accomplishes. Common Core is not so much a common curriculum as a list of skills that students are supposed to have at certain grade levels. So it's not a reading list. It's not like you have these 5 books and teach these kids these 5 books. It's, in 3rd grade, you should be able to read at this level, do this level of math and things like that. And it was developed by the National Governors Association. They got to convene a whole group of people from public education, from charter schools, from universities that see students who are unprepared, from businesses who see that they're not getting really, the skilled workers that they want to have.
And including Brewer was in that group.
Indeed, and it was an effort just to come up with an outline of, well, here's what kids should know, more than dictating from the federal government. It was pretty much a ground-up effort that then the feds put their weight behind and decided was a good idea.
And I spoke recently to David Garcia. He's the Democrat candidate for Superintendent of Public Instruction for Arizona, and he said the standards are not the problem. The problem is how we measure the standards, because the standardized tests really aren't telling us how a student is doing. And then he did something interesting. He pulls out a cell phone and he points to it and he says, this is where a lot of the knowledge is that you can get just at your fingertips. Now, he's not saying you shouldn't memorize the names of the capitals of the states and things like that. There's certain things that were just always going to be with us. But what he was saying is that it's easy to get to knowledge now. Are we teaching, however, critical thinking skills? Are we teaching problem solving? Are we teaching common sense? Can that even be taught?
Can you even teach that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what he's saying is that we need to go beyond that and challenge our kids, because he just doesn't feel like a lot of this is challenging. And also, it's interesting that the Republicans who do not like Common Core, they're not really putting up anything that's better. They're not putting up anything at all.
That is, I think, a very relevant point. Dan, to stay with you, you cover Green Valley, Sahuarita. There's been big developments this week with the Central Arizona Project water, what we commonly refer to as CAP or CAP. Bring us up to speed with what the situation is. We have the pecan groves down there, and then we have Rosemont Mine.
Right, and this is complicated, so we're just going to make it fairly simple. But there are 2 things. This week, the county board okayed a zoning change for 1,000 acres down in Green Valley that will allow FICO, which is the people who own the pecan orchards, to go ahead and develop. They aren't going to do that for many years, but that's in place, and they've done a terrific job rolling it out to the community. The bigger okay will probably come in a couple of months when they take that before Sahuarita, which they're 6,000 acres, so it's much bigger. So at some point, they're going to be developing all of these pecan groves. They call it a 40-year plan. But let's talk about water. We have an overpumping problem in Green Valley. We have more going out than's coming in as far as water goes. The problem really can be solved, can be summed up in 2 words: Rosemont Mine. And so we want the CAP water. So we have 2 groups that want to take their pipelines and hook them into the CAP pipeline, which is shared with the city of Tucson. Here's the problem. The first group is FICO, which are the pecan people, and in early February they were given the okay to do that. City of Tucson signed off on it. CAP likes the idea, that's fine. The second one is community water. The problem with community water is it's twofold. Number one, they don't have all their permits, and by the way, their line is being financed by Rosemont. Number one, they don't have all the permits, so the city of Tucson said, we're not going to give you the okay till you have all the permits. The bigger problem is that the Tucson City Council doesn't like Rosemont Mine. Somehow they have the notion that if they say no to this pipeline, that they're gonna derail the mine. Okay, it's not going to happen. So here's how we think down in Sarita. This is just what I'm thinking. Tucson City Council can screw itself over all at once. I don't care. They can take the city and do whatever they want. Now they're messing with us because they're saying we're not going to turn on the tap to the water. This is angering a lot of people.
But I have to say, being down in Sarita myself, not everyone is gung-ho for the mine. So there's some divided loyalty there.
No, but we all like to drink water.
Yes,
and that's,
we do.
And that's really what it comes down to, is the water. And what Tucson is doing is throwing a hurdle in front of this. They're not going to stop the mine. This would not stop the mine, okay? And remember this, CAP has said they both hook in or neither hooks in. Okay, and we need to remember that. So the council is not going to stop the mine. So they really just kind of need to get off their high horse and okay this when the last permit comes in. And I agree that you don't do it until that comes in. The town manager in Sarita, the mayor have written them letters, very concerned about this because Tucson has always been for us a big question mark.
I'd like to switch gears back up to Tucson Unified School District, which has been in the news with H.T. Sanchez, its new superintendent, and his relationship with a consultant that was hired for a large sum of money, $92,500, to come in, do some community development, strategic planning, things like that. One of the things that, and I know he has spoken out specifically against the Star's coverage, saying that it's not fair, which, being someone who works with the Arizona Daily Star and is on the editorial board, I would heartily disagree with. But Dylan, what is the current state?
Well, Sanchez may have a point about the one headline that was in the Star.
The headline, which was corrected.
Which was changed, yes. And you know, I think if I were H.T. Sanchez, that headline might have rubbed me the wrong way.
And just for everyone who may not have seen that headline, it put the $92,500 price tag on one day of which
a meeting that costs like $17,000,
right.
Which is still a lot of money. For
that is a lot of money.
One public meeting to
a
bring
lot
some
of money.
people
So
together.
that large figure is for, I think, 90 days worth of work. Yeah. So yes, please go ahead.
One of the issues that has a lot of people kicking is that Sanchez had a prior business relationship with the woman who runs this consulting firm when he was in Texas, running a district there, and had exchanged a couple of emails about him possibly working for that company before he came to Tucson. That didn't happen afterwards. And so there are some transparency issues here about how that decision was made to hire this firm, and was that appropriate? You know, you have to look at it and acknowledge that we hire people because they're good at what they do. They know other people who are good at what they do, and they should have you know, ideas about, well, we need this job done, we should hire this person. But when you're talking almost $100,000, you know, one, shouldn't you look around and make sure that person's the best? And two, aren't there any Tucson companies that can do that kind of thing for that amount of money?
Well, that is a question that people have been asking. But Mari, the Tucson Unified School District did an internal review, said everything was above board, everything was fine. What are you hearing about that, and what do you hear from people within the district? Is this something anyone's even paying attention if you're not H.T. Sanchez or people who pay, you know, who are
unlike us,
yes.
to get obsessed with these kinds of things? Yeah, well, first I think the other part of that with the word consultant is we should all like get rashes every time, just being in Tucson every time we hear that word. But I think what I'm hearing from folks within the district is that some of the information is kind of interesting that's coming out from some of the work that this consultant is doing now. For one, I again just discussions about curriculum and is there actual curriculum that's being delivered in the classrooms. That's being discussed right now and is of concern. But I also think, just aside from that, I think that just the discussions on how you approach a story like this when it's in the media, in the local daily, do you then spend your time bashing that said media? I don't think that's really productive. I also think that having an internal investigation is not that productive either. I think if you're really going to do it, then have someone on the outside check it out. But the state law, yes, we understand that it's permissible to have done this contract. It's under the $100,000, but when you have this kind of relationship, to me it makes complete sense that a media outlet is going to question it and look at it a little bit further, and you have to be prepared to answer those questions.
Yeah, the thing, just from following it myself and speaking with H.G. Sanchez, and it just seems that the decision to hire that firm may not have been a bad decision. You work, like you said, you work with people you want to work with people who have done a good job, but the process and saying that, oh, we had no idea that he had a prior relationship with this firm, that the other two companies invited to bid were national firms that were never going to have any interest in
they want $1 million, not $100,000.
Right, a rinky-dink thing from their point of view in Tucson Unified. So going forward, do you think this is something that signals problems for Sanchez? Is just this a sign of his immaturity as a new superintendent and in the spotlight? What do you think?
I don't necessarily think that's the case. However, I think I'll repeat what I remember telling Dr. Sanchez when I first met him and started talking about the district is really who we should we be looking to, and I think we should be looking to the governing board and the 3 majority votes, and and asking them to question more and to do their job in terms of just offering blind support and being there to also bash the local daily at the same time. I don't think that's productive. I think they need to step up and be there to question as much as possible. And we could say yes, young superintendent, but he has some experience under him. And he's experienced working with the media too, as he did in Odessa. And so it's not unusual. I think we had heard earlier from folks in Odessa that he was a little controlling about, his media relationships and getting the stories out there. So maybe this is just an example of that nature.
So Dylan, do you think that the going forward with the board, it seems to me just looking at it that Dr. Sanchez and the board have kind of have a different dynamic now. It was sort of I'm in charge, I'm the superintendent, I'm the, running the district. And as we know from watching TUSD for many years, that's not always something that the board is comfortable with. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, that is the job. That's what you hire somebody and pay them an awful lot of money to do, to make decisions and get things done, and not have the board micromanaging, have them setting broad policy goals and figuring out, well, here's the direction we want to go in, drawing up the play and letting that guy run with it. I think, unfortunately, TUSD has a pretty long history of reacting very badly when they get covered in the media, and it's not, a puff piece. Every time they get, somebody points out something that should be a little bit better, there's a witch hunt. Okay. They chase after the leaker rather than trying to fix the problem.
Right. All right, well, I'm sorry that we're going to have to end on such a short note, but thank you all very much for being here with us today. We'll be back in just a minute. That's our show for today, but you can learn more about politics by visiting news.azpm.org or by following us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Sarah Garrecht Gassen. Thanks for watching another edition of AZ Illustrated Politics.